Today's presentation is on empowerment through mine community development, how the politics of development perpetuate poverty in mining areas, a legal theoretical analysis. Our speaker today is Anri Heyns. Anri completed her BCom Law, LLB, and LLM degrees at the University of Pretoria between 2005 and 2012. She was admitted as an attorney and notary in 2010 and practiced in that capacity for 4 years with a focus on corporate, commercial, property, and contract law. She has been lecturing since 2018. In 2015, she started doing some work providing legal consultation services to mining companies, something she's doing on a part-time basis to date. Anri is working towards a PhD under the Mineral Law in Africa Research Chair with Professor Henry Mostert, and she will be giving some of the insights she has gained through the course of her studies in this presentation. Anri, over to you, please.
Hi, Thandazile. Thank you so much for the introduction. I just want to confirm I've got some background construction noise. Just let me know if it's bothersome. Then I'll see if I can try and make a plan. All the windows.
All right.
But for now, let's see how it goes. I'll just speak loudly and clear. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, just to make sure, is everybody seeing the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I am very honored to share with you today some of the aspects of my PhD research. I finalized my thesis in October and I'm hoping to graduate in December. So it really is quite an honor for me today to talk to you about some aspects of the thesis at least. You will note that it is a legal theoretical analysis, but I do try and bring some of the theoretical analysis back to a more practical application for mining communities in South Africa. So just briefly an outline what you can expect in this presentation today. I'll give a background as to my reasoning or my big idea behind the research that I did here, and then I'll go into the three main parts of the thesis. That is where I analyze the context, and I expose this concept that I call politics of development. I'll say a bit more about that later on. And then I'll consider the effects that the politics of development have for mining communities in South Africa. And then I'll end off with a few concluding remarks and recommendations. Now, poverty and inequality are ubiquitous in South Africa, especially in rural areas and areas where mining takes place. And if we look to images in the media and reports and other sources dealing with mining areas, the images that I've got here on the slide are those that are usually used to depict mining areas. It shows to the harsh socioeconomic conditions that mining areas are exposed to, and the reason why it usually is such a why a lot of emphasis is placed on these images is the fact that the mining industry still generates relative wealth in our country. But what is more is that media reports and so forth and literature on mining areas emphasize the fact that in these mining areas, you will find certain communities. And the emphasis on community here promotes a narrative of persons living together, relating to and relying on one another in some way, and therefore sharing more than just the same territory or mere living space. Mining communities obviously furthermore share in the negative effects of mining, which in many instances translate into poverty and inequality. Now, obviously, we do have legislative intervention that is supposed to or sets out to address these socioeconomic conditions facing that members or occupants of mining areas face. We've got the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act and the MPRDA, which provides for the mining charter and the social labor plan. And I'll talk a bit more about the legislation at a later point. But for now, maybe the question is just whether the legislative intervention has in fact been successful. And if you consider the conflicts and labor disputes and general unrest in mining areas over the last couple of years, the magnitude of which was so tragically exposed by the events at the Marikana mine in 2012, we cannot answer this question in the affirmative. it still seems as if there's a perception that the wealth generated by mining is not shared sufficiently with those affected by mining. So I argue that this factual problem, the living conditions that have remained unchanged despite legislative intervention, is the result of a legal problem. And this legal problem is the fact that various legislative provisions frame community, mine community, and mine community development in very ambiguous terms. The consequences of this ambiguous framing is that it's very difficult to determine who should benefit from development initiatives and how they should develop. So my argument, therefore, is as follows. Current attempts at the empowerment and development of mining communities are unsuccessful because the theoretical foundations of empowerment are embedded in a development paradigm. So as I've mentioned earlier, the thesis is structured it's divided into 3 parts, and I will now continue to highlight certain aspects of each of these parts to explain to you the argument that I am making here. So if I talk about context, as insofar as it relates to my project, I consider 2 aspects. Firstly, I consider the context within which mining communities were and are still created. And here I take a present day approach as well as an historic approach. But then obviously I also have to look at the policy and the legislation that have been put in place to intervene in the socioeconomic conditions faced by mining communities. And I then specifically have to look at the context within which the policy and legislation were created. And here I'm specifically referring to broad-based Black economic empowerment and the MPRDA, the Mining Charter, and the SLP. And then as part of this analysis, I also look at certain interpretational difficulties that I found in dealing with the legislation. So if we think of mining communities and we think of present-day mining communities, I have identified 4, you could say, issues or ways in which we look at mining communities in a present-day context. And I've done this by considering certain reports by the media and other research or activist institutions, noting that each of these reporting institutions may have a different agenda in providing these reports. And the first observation is that there's a narrative of mining communities that's promoted in most of these reports. Emphasis is placed on the proliferation of communities living in abject poverty, and legal battles between mining communities and the mining industry are typified as the poor and the marginalized coming up against the rich and the powerful. So there's a very specific narrative that is being followed whenever reporting is done on mining areas. And this is most likely as a result of the socioeconomic conditions in mining areas. Access to land, environmental degradation, lack of basic services, inadequate housing, wage disputes. These are all conditions and issues that are often faced by occupants and mine workers living in mining areas. And this then obviously directly relates to a third issue, that of labor migration. Labor migration played a significant historic role in mining in South Africa, but currently it still provides for conflict in mining areas where local, however you define it, local communities do not regard migrant laborers as forming part of these communities. And then finally, you also have to consider the stakeholder relations that are applicable. Reference is often made to what they call the unhealthy cooperation between mining companies and government, who collude to the detriment of mine workers and communities. But then there's definitely also a disjuncture between mining companies and government on how development should take place in mining areas. So that's just the present day context when we talk about mining communities. Observations. The reports are not clear on what they mean when they refer to community. This could either be land owning and traditional communities or a group of persons sharing deprivation. And furthermore, these reports are all drafted on the assumption that persons living in mining areas are poor. Now, it's very important just to emphasize the point at this point of my presentation, the argument is not being made that these persons are not poor. What I'm trying to show here is that poverty and development rhetoric is used and not scrutinized, and that there is a certain consequences flow from the use of this rhetoric in this uncritical manner. And then furthermore, also that it might be that some of the challenges identified in mining areas could be applicable in other rural areas in South Africa as well. But obviously we have to take into account the mining industry complicity in exploitative practices under apartheid and even colonial rule. So I do a brief consideration of the historical context. The point, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. The point I just want to make here is that the displacement of Black people in South Africa was caused by a European pursuit of commercial interest in South Africa. And here I consider three aspects. I look at different ideologies that have been, you could say, imposed upon local people in South Africa by first the VOC and then British colonial powers, and then how different practices and laws and so forth assisted Europeans and later on their descendants in obtaining land and labor, and then finally how the ideology and the legislation and practices regarding land and labor disrupted local livelihoods and basically meant that local Black people did not have any choice but to offer their land and labor to the colonial powers, but then eventually also to the mining industry. And this is how new communities of Black laborers were in fact created. So in this manner, I am drawing the link between the current day context and the historical context. Then if we look at policy and legislation, I place a lot of emphasis on the global climate, the global economic climate within which policies came about in the new South Africa in the early 1990s, policies specifically dealing with issues such as poverty and redistribution. And if we then consider the timing of the transition, a lot of commentators have noted that this also coincided with the dawn or the rise of new liberal economic policy. A lot has been written on that. But the argument that I'm trying to make here is that policies such as the Reconstruction and Development Program, which provided for the origins of Black economic empowerment, is therefore influenced by new liberal economic policy. And I analyzed the origins and the development of these policies to show, as many commentators have noted, this ideological shift that the ANC went through in the early 1990s from a more leftist, radical approach focusing on redistribution to a more conservative neoliberal approach. And then let's look for a moment at Black economic empowerment. Since Black economic empowerment, or actually broad-based Black economic empowerment, is promoted by the Mining Charter for the purposes of the mining industry. So as I've mentioned, the RDP provides for this idea of Black economic empowerment. And initially, the objective of BE was simply to de-racialize business ownership. So this was a measure introduced to give effect to the right to equality as protected by Section 9 of the Constitution. And initially, it entailed transferring the ownership of businesses to Black persons. This also occurred in the mining industry. Consequences hereof, it benefited an elite few. And by 2001, the BE Commission conceded that this narrow approach to BE had in fact failed. And it is here where more emphasis was placed on broad-based Black economic empowerment. And the point that I want to make here is that if we look at how broad-based Black economic empowerment is framed in the BEE Commission's report at this point, it is riddled with the development rhetoric, since it equates BEE with sustainable development to break the cycle of underdevelopment. Currently, broad-based Black economic empowerment is regulated in terms of the BBBE Act, and it operates at different levels. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Current policy and rhetoric that we can also take into account to describe this context includes the National Development Plan, calls for radical economic transformation and white monopoly capital, but I'm not going to mention too much about that for now, since there are some time constraints. So the elements promoted by BBBE, whereas initially there was this focus on equity ownership, there's also now a focus on human development and indirect empowerment. And for the purposes of the empowerment of mining communities, I will specifically be focusing on the ownership element and the socioeconomic development element as provided for by the Mining Charter. And this is where we now turn to the legislative context. What legislation is applicable if we talk about the empowerment and development of mining communities? Obviously, the Constitution sets the framework for the MPRDA, the Social Labour Plan, and the Mining Charter to operate. And as I've mentioned earlier, the Mining Charter provides for triple BE in the mining industry. And if we look at elements outside of the Mining Charter that works towards the development of mine communities, we've got the Social Labour Plan and we've got the Integrated Development Plan. And these three instruments will, to a large extent, overlap in practice, since all three of these instruments will apply to a specific mining area. And I'm not going to say too much about the MPRDA. It's safe to say that in terms of Section 100, the Mining Charter must be created, and that one of the main objectives of the MPRDA is to promote transformation in the mining industry and to provide access to the benefits of mining for historically disadvantaged South Africans. Emphasis is also specifically made of local economic development of mining areas. So what is the Social Labour Plan? For those of you who might not know, it is a plan to be drafted by mining applicants when they apply for a mining right. And the objectives of the SLP is to provide for employment and socio-economic welfare of a mining area and socio-economic development of a mining area. And one part of this plan will then specifically set out how the mining right applicant will provide for the local economic development of the area within which it will operate. Other legislation also applicable. I'll say a bit more about these acts when I deal with the definitions of community. Just briefly, what is an integrated development plan as provided for in terms of the Local Government and Municipal Systems Act? This is a plan created by each municipality for a duration. It's applicable for a period of 5 years to be renewed annually. And basically, it's the overall framework for development in an area. And insofar as a mining area falls within a specific municipality, this IDP will then also apply to that mining area. The aim of the IDP system is to overcome the legacy of apartheid plan. If we now think of the definitions of community and development, and why we want to reconsider development and empowerment in the context of mining communities in South Africa, this is because I've identified certain interpretational challenges and lack of clarity, which I will indicate now. In principle, it is not entirely clear who should benefit and how. And therefore, I will look at the definition of community, both in an international development context and in the South African context. And then we'll also have a closer look at the provisions of the Mining Charter that must provide for the empowerment of mining communities. If we think of community in an international development perspective, we usually associate it with the right to self-determination and the right to development and the right to sovereignty over resources. And then we speak of indigenous peoples or communities. Now, there's no strict or single definition of indigenous peoples, but if you consider various sources on the topic, such as the Working Group on Indigenous Populations publications, there are a few characteristics that most indigenous peoples comply with. For instance, they've got a unique cultural identity, close relationship with land occupied, they usually constitute a minority group. There's a continuity with pre-colonial societies. They regard themselves as separate of other current day group and usually do not hold significant political power. But an international development perspective does not only view community as indigenous peoples. There's also a very clear link between community and poverty from this perspective. And one example of this is the World Bank's Community-Driven Development Poverty Reduction Strategy. And if we look at this document and the way it refers to communities and to poverties, it becomes very clear that there is this assumption that community, in the way that it's used in a development sense, is always poor. So at this point, and it was only a very superficial glance at international development policies that I've taken here, but at this point, we can see that two types of commonalities are acknowledged in terms of the international development perspectives. In other words, two types of communities, if you want to put it like that, On the one hand, we've got this idea of shared familial ties, custom and land associated with indigenous communities. And on the other hand, this idea of shared poverty, which in our local context, our mining context, would then translate into mining communities, as I'll show in a moment. South African law, if we consider the Constitution and what the Constitution has to say about development and community, Section 152 provides for socio-economic development of areas governed by municipalities. This translates into the IDP. And Section 24B refers to sustainable development. Neither of these sections make specific reference to community. So no link is drawn between development and community by the Constitution. Section 31 refers to community, but in the sense that the rights of persons to form a cultural, religious, or linguistic community is protected. Here again, no reference is made to development. Mining legislation and the definition of community and mine community, here things get a bit more tricky. So the definition of community in the MPRDA has been changed quite a couple of times, as has the definition in the mining charter. At this point, if we take the MPRDA and the 2018 mining charter into consideration, we'll see that the MPRDA speaks of the community, the mining charter speaks of the host community, but what it comes down to, it's a group of Black or historically disadvantaged persons with interests or rights in land exercised communally in terms of an agreement, custom, or law. Mine community, as provided for in the mining charter, the MPRDA does not make use of the terminology mine community, refers to communities where mining takes place and labor sending areas and adjacent communities within local municipalities. The social labor plan does not define or make use of the terminology community, but the socioeconomic development that must take place should be aimed at the mining area. And here we can look at the MPRDA that defines mining area as including land and surface adjacent to the area where extraction has been authorized. Non-mining legislation applicable in this instance, in other words, legislation that also define community. The Local Government Municipal Systems Act that provides for the creation of the IDP defines local community as persons residing in the municipality, the ratepayers of the municipality, organizations involved in the local affairs of the municipality, and visitors making use of municipal services. The Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act might also in certain instances be applicable to mining areas, since if we look at the Platinum Belt, for instance, there are many mining operations that take place on land in which traditional communities have an interest. And how does the Act define traditional community? Such a community will be recognized if certain requirements are met, if it is subjected to traditional leadership determined by the community's customs, and if the community observes community law or customary law, but customary law is not defined. In many instances, traditional communities or other types of communities living in mining areas also form part of the land reform program. So the Restitution of Land Rights Act is also possibly applicable to mining areas, and here community is defined as any group of persons whose rights in land are derived from shared rules determining access to land held in common by such a group. You can also look at the Communal Property Association Act that defines or speaks of community as a group of persons desirous of regulating interest in property under shared rules, wishes to or is required to form association under the CPAA, and then also a community whose land rights have been reinstated in terms of the Restitution of Land Rights Act. And then finally, the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act has recently been held by our courts that this act protects informal land rights also when applying for mining rights. And here, a community is defined as any group of persons whose rights in land are derived from shared rules determining access to land held in common by such groups. Okay, so observations that I make at this point after viewing the definitions of community. In principle, 3 types of communities or commonalities are acknowledged by the law. We've got traditional communities sharing custom, family, and land. We've got mine communities sharing the effects of mining, and we've got geographic communities that share space. But if we consider the fact that the legislation that I've just mentioned all deal with the legacy of apartheid and exploitative practices and poverty and land restitution and so forth, we can also determine that underlying to all three of these communities is the sense of shared poverty as a communality. Now, by providing different configurations of community in the context of mine community development, the law potentially includes the broadest group of persons to benefit from development initiatives. The commonality shares by the different communities can therefore also overlap. In other words, in one mining area, we can have these different groups or communities, but that might also overlap. But there is a very real risk that arbitrary exclusion can occur, especially since the different empowerment and development measures aimed at these different communities are not formulated in very clear terms. And a further observation that I make at this point is that the law either provides for preserving this idea of community or for transforming this idea of community. And the community that is being preserved is the one that has some kind of an inherent identity and that shares family, land, and culture. But on the other hand, other communities that lack this inherent identity, that only share poverty and the effects of mining, is required to transform. And this is here where I find that the law possibly creates further inequalities in how it deals with communities, but a bit more on that later. How does the mining charter then provide for communities in mining areas? How does it provide for the empowerment of these communities? Basically, on the one hand, you get mine community development. It's one of the elements of the mining charter that the mining right holder must promote in order to attain its accreditation in terms of the mining charter and the MPRDA. But also, since one of the recent drafts of the mining charter, shares or ownership must also be provided to what is called the host community. So I'm comparing those two empowerment measures as I'll show in a moment. What is very clear is that the drafters of the mining charter had quite a lot of challenges in framing, firstly, the definition of community and mine community, and then also framing how these communities should be empowered. And this is evident if we see the various drafts that we've had and the way in which each draft approaches mine community development slightly differently. So the 2004 mining charter was the first charter, the 2010, the second charter, and then in 2017, we had the first draft that caused quite a lot of controversy. But just note the different approaches that each charter has had, specifically as regards to the alignment of the IDP and incorporation of compliance with the social labor plan. The 2018 mining charter, the final charter for now, defined mine community in this manner, as we've already discussed. And basically what it requires of the mining right holder is to identify development priorities through consultation. This is not that new, but what is new is that these priorities must then be contained in the social labor plan, and assessment or compliance with the mine community development element of the mining charter is no longer assessed in terms of the mining charter, but it's now assessed as part of the SLP system. And this might create some confusion, and it asks as to the validity or the importance of this whole mine community development element, but possibly it's also an attempt at alignment with other development initiatives without mentioning how alignment with the IDP will take place. So that was mine community development. The other empowerment initiative in the mining charter is aimed at host communities, and it determines that shares in the mining company must now be given to host communities. Before 2016, no mention was made of community or mine community in the context of ownership in the mining company. The 2016 draft of the mining charter for the first time stated that shares in the mining company must be given to communities. 2017 draft charter said shares in the mining company must be given to mine communities, and a very broad definition of mine community was included in this draft. But then finally, the 2018 mining charter determines that host communities, and what's a host community again? It's community in the local district, metropolitan municipality within which the mining area as defined in the MPRDA is located. It is assumed here that community in this instance is as defined in the MPRDA, which is similar to a traditional community. So 5% shares must be transferred to host communities to be held in a community trust, and the benefits received from the shareholding must be used for a host community development program. Now, the problem here is, whereas the mining charter says that the host community development program should not replace the mine community development initiative, no indication is given as to how these two initiatives should actually interact or be aligned. And also, if we consider all the different drafts and the fact that there has been significant changes to what mine community development entails, it becomes clear that possibly no one is really exactly sure what mine community development should include. And this is where I would like to expose the politics of development. And what I mean with politics of development is as follows. I'm stating that the empowerment of mining communities in South Africa fall within or is situated in the global development paradigm. And for that reason, empowerment is exposed to the underlying political and ideological assumptions of the global development paradigm. And this is what I then refer to as the politics of development. So I then make the point that the politics of development affect the construction of development solutions for mining communities. Now you might ask, what do I mean with the global development paradigm? And to explain this, I have a look at the concepts development, empowerment, community, and poverty. A lot has been written on this idea of development, and I'm definitely not going to spend too much time on this. Safe to say that it is generally, especially by post-development scholars and more leftist scholars, it is accepted that development is not a politically and ideologically neutral term or concept. It has its origins in the West, and it promotes to a large extent Western or Eurocentric views or values. And the assumptions underlying the promotion of development, in other words, aspects that are generally required to see that development takes place, such as modernization, legal formalization, economic policy, and ideology, are all based on certain Western or Eurocentric ideas. Modernization is then also specifically linked with progress, this idea that society must uphold rationality, science, and technology. Legal formalization and the rule of law and fundamental values. Here, when development practices have been implemented over the years, the model systems that have been upheld by institutions providing development finance were Western legal systems. Also, the overemphasis on property rights and the fact that the law should provide the foundation for market relation and limit state intervention in the economy all show to this assumption or this critique that development really is not a politically or ideologically neutral concept. And the same can then be said of empowerment and local economic development. Empowerment is regarded as the World Bank's way to shift towards a more bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. This is visible in their community-driven development policy. So the idea is to include the voices of the poor in the conversations on their well-being, but still this idea is embedded in this idea of progress or transformation. And if the question is asked, progress to or transformation into what, some Western or Eurocentric standard is usually provided. If we think now, so that's development. That's how development has been understood and criticized. And if we then look at the definition of community, you will recall that after my analysis of the legislative definitions, I've observed that the law preserves community on the one hand, but on the other hand, it tries to transform community into something else. And this community that's being preserved is usually one that has some kind of an essence or an identity, whereas the community that should be transformed really has no inherent identity other than sharing poverty. So what I've done here is I've considered theoretical perspectives on community. I've looked at European sociologists such as Tony's and his view on community. And what was specifically useful for me in this point is his creation of a dichotomy between community and society to deal or to show or to analyze the effects that modernization, and we could say development, had on European communities. And I'm not going to go into much detail here. You will note that if we compare community to society, community has more of a obviously communal association, constant reaffirmation of tradition and culture, where society, the individual comes first. And the individual's identity obviously comes before the society's identity. And important then is that property viewed in the society as wealth and in the community as a community of place. The observation that I've drawn after doing this theoretical analysis is that there are some similarities between this essentialist or authentic type of community and our traditional communities in South Africa. Obviously, we cannot use a European sociologist analysis to explain or to understand communities in South Africa, but this similarity was quite useful for me in this specific instance. And then the next point is that whenever a community with such an inherent or essential identity has been suffering injustice because its identity has been denied or its essence has been denied, as has been the case under apartheid or under colonial rule more globally, then the law amends for this injustice by recognizing such a community. And how is a community recognized? It's provided with legal rights and legal subjectivity. If the community is the community to be transformed, lacking this coherent and inherent identity, then development is required. And the socioeconomic conditions and poverty cannot be cured by merely recognizing such a community. And this is then where I had a look at poverty, the concept of poverty, just to show also that there are various definitions of poverty, various views on the causes of poverty and the nature. I mean, we can agree that it's a lack of basic necessities, but the nature of the basic necessities and how they should be met, there are various views on that. In a pragmatic development approach, poverty is regarded as something that's measurable, and poverty lines are used in this instance. But poverty lines are also critiqued for turning poverty into a binary aspect and for effectively creating the poor. And then also a poverty line will have to reflect the standards of the institution that applies the poverty line. And in development practice, usually these institutions are situated in the West or in Europe. So the bottom line here is just that poverty is not a natural or a neutral universal concept. So poverty rhetoric also will have certain assumptions implied when it is used. If we problematize the paradigm, I've already anticipated some of the points of critique against development, but I sort of elaborate on this argument by saying that the politics of development causes the universalization of views and values, and it effectively creates the poor. And I then assess theoretically what the effect of the politics of development is for developing peoples. And if I say views and values are universalized, I make use of two specific examples, and that is that this paradigm promotes a very specific singular view on the law and how the law, what role the law should play in development practice, and it very often denies or ignores the values of developing societies. And also this emphasis on property rights and economic growth. The critique of the development paradigm in this regard is that this theory of property rights ignores that there are different legal histories, even in the Western world, of showing that there are different conceptions of property rights. So it's a very oversimplified view of property rights that is being promoted in the paradigm. But the importance of property rights in this instance, obviously, is the fact that the mining charter provides shares to host communities. So the significance of property rights in a development framework then is important to highlight. And the effect for developing people is that because of the colonial history and the disparity in power relations between former colonizers and colonies, these values are then imposed upon developing peoples. If we say that the paradigm effectively creates the poor, the paradigm implies a certain relationship between the developed and the developing worlds. As Esteva has noted, development is a way of forcing beneficiaries to accept their relative inferiority and inadequacy, and for them to evolve and advance towards something else. And then important, the way in which this paradigm frames the law and the role of the law all follows a new liberal construct. So it's a very functionalist conception of poverty. What this means is that in a development framework, for you to be regarded as developed, you have to be able to hold property, contracting, and other rights. As in a new liberal market, that is how you access goods and services. And legal subjectification, therefore, has to take place because only a legal subject can hold rights. But if you form part of a group of vulnerable persons, such as a mining community, and you do not lack the cohesiveness or the inherent essence or identity required for you to be regarded as a legal subject, you will not qualify and you will not be able to hold rights and consequently not be able to access goods and services. Effect for developing people here is then obviously that development is set as a standard against which developing people are measured. Now, coming back to the more practical aspects of my research, the effects for mining communities in South Africa. And I've already mentioned this fact that the law either provides for the recognition of communities or for distribution of resources to communities. It wants to preserve this essentialist type of community on the one hand, and it wants to transform or develop the other type of community. And here I look at the significance of shareholding because host communities receive shares. Obviously in South Africa, shares are regarded as property, and we've got a Companies Act, and the company has got a memorandum of incorporation. So the relationship between a shareholder and the company is quite well regulated. So by affording someone or some community the right to own shares, it's a very clear empowerment initiative. If we think, then we can think of the host community that acquires the shares in their company as a legal subject, and this is significant in a new liberal construct, obviously. If we look at a mining community and the development of mining communities, this is framed in much broader and vague terms. And mining communities are still presented as poor and helpless and not being able to be qualify as legal subjects to hold rights. So already here we can see the disparity and the unequal treatment of these two types of communities. And then obviously mining communities cannot then be regarded as legal subjects, but they are regarded as poor, and certain assumptions are used to attribute certain characteristics to them in this regard. And then the other point that I've picked up on is then if we look at this concept, community development, it actually provides a paradox because community shows to an inherent identity or essence that should be preserved, but development provides for transformation. So theoretically, at least, community development is not actually possible. Then just a few concluding remarks. I conclude that the legislative formulation of initiatives aimed at the empowerment and development of mining communities reflects the underlying values of specific theoretical ideological paradigm. An analysis of the theoretical paradigm shows that attempts at understanding who should benefit and how they should benefit in mining operations, of the way in which these are formulated creates challenges and will always be inaccurate because the paradigm operates on predetermined perceptions. The arguments I've outlined in this thesis are of a theoretical nature. However, it is put forward that the creators of policy and the drafters of legislation dealing with empowerment and development of mining communities should take heed of the implications of accepting development and community rhetoric in legislation. So I then just make 3 recommendations in this regard. Just note that some of the post-development scholars argue that we should abandon this idea of development in totality, but other scholars note that if we do that, the liability that has been established on the developed world would then be abandoned. And I would think that a similar thing would happen in the mining industry if we were just to abandon this whole construct. So if we then work within this paradigm and we draft policy and legislation within this paradigm, I would say that we have to be cognizant when using or when dealing with different community forms. So obviously the mining charter and the BBBE structure does acknowledge that there are different actors in the mining area. We've got different communities, we've got being entrepreneurs, we've got the mining workers. But when framing provisions that deal with different types of community in one area, a more holistic approach should be taken. So the point that I want to make here is we cannot just keep on amending the mining charter by tweaking definitions of community, mine community, and mine community development. The second recommendation is that greater internal cohesion of the elements of the mining charter is required. And specifically, the link or the interaction between this host community development program that should be funded under the ownership element and mine community development projects under the mine community development element. The interaction between these projects in practice should be considered, and the alignment should be explained in the mining charter so that interpretation is made more easy. And then finally, I would say that a cautious approach should be taken to the rhetoric of community and in the same sense, poverty. What we've seen is that there are different understandings of community, but it's very easy just to promote this essentialist inherent identity, authentic type of community understanding. And especially if we've got different types of communities, that if a document refers to different types of community, such as in the case of the mining charter, the impression is created that mine community should be assessed in the same manner as community, and that it is possible to determine the identity of the members and the leadership structures of such a community. So that is then my third recommendation. So then really just my final words, I'm not arguing that mine communities should be recognized for the identity that they represent, or that traditional communities should only be acknowledged to the extent that they are poor. Rather, the argument is that because of this neoliberal development paradigm within which empowerment operates, differential treatment of these groups of people in framing of legislation perpetuates inequality and conflict in mining areas. So the ambiguous terms within which community and mine community is drafted puts mining companies in a powerful but also a difficult position. On the one hand, they can use the opportunity to give effect to obligations in the manner that they deem fit, which may not always be beneficial to mining communities. But on the other hand, it's not exactly clear what mining communities can expect from mining companies. So the perception amongst mining communities that mining companies operate only for their own benefit will be reinforced. In this manner, the power relations in the mining area that have been founded even before the first mineral resources were found in South Africa remain untouched. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anri, for your very detailed presentation. You've given us quite a comprehensive cover of mine community and the global as well as local view of what mine community development would be and who is involved in that process. We have a few questions on the discussion on the Q&A box, and I would like to ask you to jump right straight into it. We have about 9 minutes left in webinar, and I would like for us to wrap up in time. So the first question is from David Young. Can you comment on the Royal Bafokeng Nation model and the way at one time the DME did not consider it to be an HDSA entity?
Okay, thank you for the question, David. I must admit, I did not, I looked at the Royal Bafokeng Nation as one of the successful models of how they've gone about in structuring the financing and the beneficiation, well, the sharing of benefits in their communities. But I did not really go into much detail as to how they are approached by the DME and so forth. So I can only assume that, and this is my assumption based on what I know about how all of this work, is that the fact that possibly because it's been so successful, or that the whole poverty rhetoric just did not work anymore in describing Royal Bafokeng Nation, if we compare it to different other communities in mining areas that really do not face the same socioeconomic conditions than the RBM. But that's really just a assumption that I'm making at this point.
Thank you for that. Then the next question is from an anonymous attendee, and his question is on the definition of mining operation. How do you define it? And they go on to give a scenario. If I receive a mining right, for example, a subsidiary's name, then do I do an ownership agreement at the subsidiary level where the right is held, or should the shareholding be in the entire group, which may involve mines located in other provinces, even other countries, is located in other communities and includes a processing plant, a rail contract, ships to move product. I attended a meeting where a community in the Eastern Cape was the shareholder, but when the company expanded to KZN, the Eastern Cape partner were the designated shareholders, and the KZN project could not proceed due to one community not wanting to have another community benefiting from the minerals. So what definition of mining operation are you considering relevant, and why that definition? If you could take just a minute or two to give us an answer to that.
Okay, so I think this question touches on different issues. I think the basic definition of mining operation would be as the MPRDA defines it. But if we talk about shareholding and ownership for the purposes of the mining charter, then we are talking about something else. So the mining charter does have certain provisions that they call it, the charter, or actually it's the BBBE framework, speaks of the flow through principle. That's where you've got different subsidiaries and different levels of shareholding, and how then it is assessed what the percentage of Black shareholding is in that mining company. That's a bit complicated. I'm not going to go into that now. What I can say about communities and shareholding, if we look at the mining charter as it is at present, it refers to, and I think this has been practiced even before the mining charter has in fact codified it. The shares are held in a trust. And because, as I've just mentioned now, there are many communities in the one mine, there could possibly be more than one community in the mining area, there might be conflicting beneficial interests. So I think here to say that the community was the shareholder is possibly not an accurate description, because the trust would have been the shareholder. And it's, I mean, I would have to know a bit more about this factual scenario, but the interaction between the different beneficiaries of the trust is possibly what was the problem in this instance. But this shows to illustrate how difficult it is to give shares to a community, and even so, and more so if a trust, because a trust structure would have been used, a trust structure is then put between you. So I don't think I'm answering the question, but I think it touches on different issues that can create complications in this regard.
Thank you for that, Anri. Before we move on to the last question from the panelists, there is some congratulatory messages on your presentation from Lezola and from Bailongo. Quite impressed with your presentation, and they hope to see a book come out of it. Then our next question comes from Alexandra. In your work, have you come across good examples in other countries where a more critical or careful approach has been taken to host or mine communities' definition and its link to the desired impact, e.g. improved quality of life, self-determination, etc., taking into account that most other major mining countries are Western, but wondering if South American or other countries from the global South have shown high potential?
Okay, so thank you for that. I did not do a comparative study. Reason being that I first wanted, so I think my point is that this theoretical framework within which we are working, and I'm assuming various other countries are also working, is problematic. I think this question asking has been taken to the definition and it's linked to desired impact. I think that's possibly where further research or so could come in, is to say, but what is the desired impact that we want these initiatives to have? Because I think what is clear is that if we just pursue development for development's sake, the desired impact is not clear at all. And I think here, obviously, and another issue that I could not deal with in my thesis is consultation, because consultation is supposed to indicate what the desired impact should be. But, and this I've heard from South American examples, from Canadian examples, from examples all over the world. Consultation is problematic. And I think that's possibly where we should take our aim, is to see what should the desired impact be. But now, unfortunately, I haven't come across something that addressed the issues that I'm specifically raising. I actually think dealing with the concept community, not to deny the positive aspects of using community rhetoric, the fact that we all are independent and interdependent and so forth. I think there's great power and a positive aspect to using community rhetoric, but I think using that terminology in legal documents, at least, it's very tricky.
Thank you very much, Anri. It's 14:58. We will be closing off soon. We will ask Anri to share her slides with us, and should you wish to have access to those, please drop us an email. You can respond to the invitation email that you received to join the webinar today. And thank you so much, Anri. In another place, another time, I would have been asking for a round of applause for your presentation. And good day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.